By now, that most of us are still questioning regarding the word globalization. Because when it comes to the word globalization, very often we tend to think about conflicts, wars, and most importantly, people are still questioning if the democratic system is still workable today. But meanwhile, a related topic, under globalization, we also need to pay attention to another major issue that too often some of the rich countries are walking away from it, which is climate change. We know that for some countries that climate change seems to be one of the hoaxes that people are questioning today. But meanwhile, this is a real issue that we really need to pay attention. Not only it matters to the countries in Europe, to America, but also across the nations in Asia as well. Well, that's why today we're going to talk about all those matters. And how about the international changes today under climate change? Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to have Mr. Paul Hockenos. Now, Paul is a Berlin writer who covers renewable energy and the climate crisis. He's the prize-winning author of 4 books on European affairs and was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Paul, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, Paul, the pleasure is all mine. Now, let's get started. Initially, when I discovered you, because this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, "The Global South is Done Playing Mr. Nice Guy. Developing countries are finally ready to play hardball over climate reparation." Paul, again, going back to the article, we know that back in 2021, and this United Nations Climate Change Conference, and so we know as COP26 in 2021, it didn't seem as achieved a lot of goals. And also you mentioned this in the article as well. There was a lot more projects or a lot more, the progress on climate change was delayed. Now, we know that very soon we're going to see this COP27. So first of all, can you help us to understand the significance of United Nations Climate Change Conference at this moment?
Okay. Well, the COPs are the annual UN summit addressing the issue of the climate crisis. And it's been going on now for 27 years, and we have the 27th one this year in Egypt. And they are extraordinarily important because this is the moment when all of the countries of the world come together to hash out their goals and aims and to make progress on curbing global warming. And it took many, many years to get everybody even on the same page to admit that there is this problem, and it has become ever more urgent. And by now, almost all of the members of the United Nations, 190 plus, also attend the COP. And each year they meet again. They set different kinds of goals. Or 5 years ago, they set goals, for example, and then kind of come together and see if they've met them or not, or where progress has been made. Each one has a slightly different focus. But this, on the number 27 that's coming up starting on November 6th, we're going to be looking at each of their countries' nationally determined goals, and whether they've met them over the past 5 years, and can they increase them for the next 5 years. So it's seen as a very, very important moment in the global fight against climate change.
Well, but Paul, again, going back to the article that you mentioned, rich countries, number one, they have the opportunities to contribute so much more regarding this climate crisis that we're facing today. But in reality, the rich countries today, they're actually walking away, or perhaps, I want to be careful, intentionally that distance themselves from contributing to the climate change crisis at this moment. Now, help us to understand what are the possible reasons for the rich countries to keep on ignoring or walking away from this critical issue. Again, as we mentioned before, when it comes to climate change, it does not just only affect one country on the planet. It actually affects that all countries and all humanities. But why? What are the reasons that for the rich countries treat it as not as the priority, but treat it as something or the second class? Help us to understand, Paul.
Okay. Let me just backtrack a little bit, because there are basically two pillars, or have been thus far, in these negotiations, and two kind of target areas: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is the fight to prevent further climate change, to prevent more greenhouse gases going into the air, and to prevent the rising of temperatures, to mitigate future emissions and the future harm to the planet. So it's looking into the future and taking measures now, like rolling out renewable energy, for example, shutting down gas, all kinds of different fossil fuel generation, electric cars. All of this is really kind of looking towards the future. I know, maybe just a couple of years in the future, or maybe decades, or even beyond that. That's one pillar. The second one is called adaptation. And that is aimed to help all countries, as you say, who are now affected by climate change, and all are, some more than others, to adapt and to make adaptations so that they can better weather this crisis. That goes from changing the kind of agriculture that one nation will use, to protecting coastal cities from high waters, etc. And so thus far, those have been the two pillars. Now, there has also always been the issue of the global south and the developing countries, who are not responsible either for a large share of emissions today, nor were they historically. And yet they are being hit very hard in terms of climate change. Of course, the best examples are earlier this year. I mean, right now, a third of Pakistan is underwater, or had been, because of torrential, mega monsoons. There across Africa, there have been both drought and flooding. And so, I mean, there's the pledge, which was part of an earlier COP, that the wealthier nations contribute $100 billion a year to help the poorer nations. And the fact of the matter is that has not even been close to hit any one year. Last year, for example, the amount was, depending on who's counting, in between about 27 million and 80 million out of 100. So already there you have a discrepancy, and you have an unfairness in the whole process towards the global south. I mean, they have every right to be extraordinarily angry that they are on the front line of suffering, where they were not on the front line of making those emissions, neither presently nor in the past 100 years. But now they want to bring in a third pillar, which is that of losses and damages, or you could call it reparations or compensation. They're saying that, listen, our countries have been hit so hard by this. We need the money not only to mitigate in the future, not only to adapt for the present and the near future, but what about the losses, the liability that we have suffered and are suffering? Who's going to pay for that? That's not our fault. We want those losses and damages paid for, and they're claiming that as it is in most legal systems, that there's the issue of liability. Are the richer, wealthier nations, the global north, the developed countries, are they liable for these losses and damages? And if they were, then law would have it, then they have to pay for those. They have to pay for those losses and damages. The North would have to pay compensation, and the global South, or you could just say kind of the poor countries, because it's not simply the global South, but they want a third pillar, losses and damages, and they want a mechanism, a facility that would adjudicate then these cases and kind of decide, where's liability and how much is that worth, and that they would then, have to, send the bill to the richer nations in proportion of what they are responsible for this problem, both historically and presently. So that's the background. And until now, the global north, indeed, particularly the United States, and thus far most of the European Union, has said, no, they don't want to go that route. And there are two reasons for this. One, I think actually makes some sense, and that is that, listen, let's put this money towards mitigation. In the future, 5, 10 years, or even 50 years down the line, we or our children or our grandchildren are going to have a planet that they can live on. And, let's adapt. The other thing is, of course, adaptation. We have to change things because we have to be ready for what's coming. And that were we to take money away from those two priorities, that they would suffer, and simply the whole problem would get a whole lot worse. Now, that's one reason. That's what U.S. climate envoy John Kerry, that's basically his argument, which one can follow. Of course, what they don't say is that were there liability, the United States and Europe would have to pay a lot of money. And historically, the United States alone is responsible for 25% of all greenhouse gases, Europe 22%. And currently, the numbers are only slightly different. I believe that China is the number one emitter of greenhouse gases, followed by the United States and Europe. So we have this situation that would mean that there would be a huge issue of how big would this compensation would be, and who would pay it and why. And as you can imagine, the richer countries are unhappy about this and don't want to see it go that way.
Paul, again, I'm very glad that you used the country, of course, that you directly mentioned the country of Pakistan. And we know that not too long ago, this devastation cost, again, according to the number that you wrote, more than 1,000 people dead and 8 million displaced, that 1.7 million homes destroyed. To be honest, when I was just reading those numbers and again, just trying to understand, it's not just about what happened to Pakistan, but also it's about the devastation and the impact on those people. Again, so that's why I think in one hand, in reality, people have to wake up and to understand that climate crisis, it's actually taking place in every single corner of our lives. But on the other hand, Paul, I want to ask another direct question. Do you think today, when we come to climate change, or when it comes to climate change crisis, are the countries, particularly the rich countries, politicizing this issue? So in other words, are they actually looking at it as a real deal or as a real crisis that really need to put more effort, or at least we can contribute some, or they're using this as a political soundbite or as a political negotiation in order to get something else behind the doors? What's your take on that?
I mean, it's of course you can't put all countries together in this, and even within one country like the United States, you have some administrations that think it's not worth being involved in it all, and don't really believe in the evidence that the scientists have accumulated over the years that show without any doubt, above any suspicion, that there is climate change happening and that there is a climate crisis and climate breakdown. I would say that that President Biden and the Democrats, do take this issue seriously and have passed legislation that puts hundreds of billions of dollars toward different mitigation and adaptation mechanisms and strategies. And the European Union embarked on the European Green Deal many years ago. You could say it really even started 20 years ago, and has long taken it very seriously. All of Europe right now is in the midst of a transition to renewable energies. Germany runs on 50% of its electricity comes from renewable sources. Some countries like Denmark and Iceland and Norway and Portugal even more than that. So I think that they have now, and particularly as the evidence mounts, like the extreme weather, the warming and rising of the seas, the melting of the glaciers, this impact on biodiversity, the out of control forest fires from the United States to Australia, in Siberia as well, etc. I think now there is an overwhelming acceptance on the majority of states and the majority of people that this is a major problem. And opinion polls also show that everywhere in the world, it has kind of climbed up as an issue to be taken seriously and one that voters are concerned about. So I think that's a huge step forward. But significant action then has to follow, and this is not what has not what happened. These different countries have not, in fact, almost all of the countries haven't lived up to the targets and the goals that they set at the different COPs over the years. And so that's why this one in Egypt is so important. It's to get everybody back on track and to up their targets in order that we can prevent global warming from exceeding 2 degrees by 2100.
Paul, just now you mentioned one of the critical countries that actually making a lot of noises lately, which is China. Now, looking at this country, there are 1.4 billion people living in this country, and we know that when we talk about climate change, or when we talk about the climate crisis, that China, especially under the current government, has been very vocal and supportive in moving along the project, and hopefully not only by political, but also by economic matters that contribute to a lot. But meanwhile, when we look at China today, that again, comparatively speaking, population-wise, America, Denmark, and Germany. So my next question is, for the country as China is so large and this, again, on this unstoppable track for this economic growth, how could we hold China accountable? Or so in other words, how do we know that China is willing, even though, as you mentioned, Paul, that for the gas emission is right after the America or, other countries. But again, how do we know that China is committed seriously in battling against the climate crisis? How can we do that? Because we're looking at different political atmosphere, looking at different economic agenda. So what is your take on that?
I mean, I think there's really only one way, and that is to convince China that it is a serious problem and threat to China, which it is. There's nothing you can really do to make other countries take action if they themselves are not convinced of it themselves. So, I mean, it's really up to China to take a look at the problem and to understand what it is and how dangerous it is and how much it threatens their own country and its stability, the health of its people, and in the end, its political elite as well. They're just simply not serving their people in a responsible and respectable way if they ignore this very egregious threat. But there's nothing that can be done to make a country participate. It's really up to them. And they have to be convinced of its necessity and urgency.
Paul, I want to go back to the article. Again, this is something that you wrote is quite interesting. And it says, despite the moral imperative, the Global South hopes to actually institutionalize another basket of funding is probably doomed, even if it makes its way onto the agenda. And in 2009, the well-heeled countries committed to mobilize $100 million per year for developing countries to pay for climate measures. Now, given the fact that you mentioned today, or mentioned briefly, that countries such as Pakistan, such as Nepal, number one, those countries are still facing the climate crisis. And number two, they're still living in this economic instability. But meanwhile, if the rich countries are not really committed as much as they should, how about those vulnerable countries? Do they have any alternatives, or should they look for any other ways to prevent something as flooding what happened in Pakistan? So in other words, if, put in a simple way, if nobody helps, or if everyone it's not willing to help or contribute so much, what could be the alternative for the vulnerable states?
The first is that the wealthier countries pony up and pay what they said that they were going to, and probably more as well. I mean, I don't think that losses and damages is going to be established as a third pillar. But as these negotiations go, there's often some horse trading going on, and they might be able to get something else from it. That we can hope. And I mean, outside of that, I mean, I think that these countries have to take seriously themselves. And I mean, there have long been monsoons, but the way that the agriculture and the way that rivers have all been changed, and that they no longer absorb water the way they used to. All the way cities are built, etc. I mean, this all has to change. This is all really kind of in adaptation. But these countries have made huge mistakes themselves, and they can do a lot to get back on track themselves. It's not just up to someone else to pay for it, and they have to come out and realize what kind of adaptation measures are necessary and take them. I mean, they have not been any better than. Well, I mean, you could also argue that those structures were handed down from colonialism. So go back again. The circle comes around. But whatever the case, and they can take action themselves, regardless of the amount of money that the richer nations want to help them with.
So in other words, it's not just about dependency. It's more about collective efforts, and I think that really could make a significant difference. Paul, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. I know, again, as we mentioned in the intro, you've written 4 different books on European affairs, and I want to get your reaction on what's happening in the United Kingdom lately. That we know that this country lately, I know you're laughing, and I feel the same way, but anyway. This country just elected a brand new prime minister, but given the fact that the predecessor only lasted around 44 days, but also last year COP was held in United Kingdom as well. So I want to get your reaction is, based on the current or the newly elected prime minister for the country, how much change can we expect? Not only for the economic perspective, but also for the global efforts from contribution from this country. What do you think?
I don't really expect any more, or maybe even less than last time when they hosted it. You would think they would have been most generous. I think also that the UK is really, right now, terribly focused on its own problems, all of which are a result of Brexit. I mean, this is the source of all of their problems at the moment, and of the different prime ministers, and of this prime minister, and those that follow. I mean, it's all the fallout of Brexit, which has been every bit as bad as the critics of Brexit predicted. I don't see any short-term solution for the UK. And unfortunately, until they get their own matters straightened out, they're going to be punching below their weight in international negotiations and on a geopolitical global level. So I'm not really expecting much at all.
Well, Paul, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to the European affairs. Now, when we look at the countries, not only that in Europe, but also across the continent, because of the war in Ukraine, and not only that really woke up the entire international community to understand this energy crisis that we're facing in the results of the war, but on the other hand, it provides a mechanism for all the countries to be united in order to provide or come up with much better or feasible solutions, so in order to avoid major disasters. Now, from your perspective, at this moment, despite the fact the war is still taking place, in your opinion, how much more can we expect from the European countries that really bring this joint effort in order to avoid much greater disaster in energy shortage? So can you help us to understand how significant is the impact today, even though it doesn't look like Russia is going to win in the end?
Europe has been thrown into an unprecedented energy crisis, which, if we get a cold winter, could be very threatening to populations, to industry, to the economies. It's going to be extreme. It is extremely rough right now. Energy prices have skyrocketed, and they will continue to go up over the course of the winter. President Vladimir Putin of Russia has put Western Europe into a very bad place. It isn't in a corner. I think, however, that the policies that the Europeans have agreed upon at the EU level, but also at the national level, are going to fare them very well. I think that we're going to make it through the winter. It's going to mean conservation. I haven't turned on the heat yet here. In my office, everybody's wearing 2 sweaters and a scarf. It's kind of almost like an informal competition, who can hold out longer. But we have to conserve energy. And ultimately, then kind of looking beyond this winter or beyond this crisis with Ukraine. And you're right. I mean, Russia is not going to win. Ukraine will win. And Ukraine will be built up to be maybe even a better country than it was before. But there's also right now, as part of the whole energy crisis, there's a massive drive to transition to renewable energy, which has been going on now for 20 years, but now it's really been shifted into 5th gear. And right now, there's a solar boom going on in Germany. Across the country, it's impossible. Actually, there's a waiting list of 9 months to get solar panels put up on your roof. All the heat pumps, which is an electrical form of geothermal energy, very, very energy efficient, is also booming. And the European Union has put in a special package to increase conservation, increase energy efficiency, to insulate houses, to roll out renewable energy, to wind down fossil fuels. And, once this happens, it's going to put Europe in a much stronger position than any other place in the world. It'll be more energy efficient. It will have, renewable energy. Wind and solar is the cheapest out there by a long shot. If we're using less energy and the energy that we're using is the cheapest, and if it comes from the wind and the sun, ultimately then Europe is going to emerge stronger. But we'll really have to see what's going to happen over the next 2 years. And, I can't make any predictions, but a lot of the changes that were made necessary by the climate crisis are now being taken because of the Ukraine crisis. That's why this is happening. That's why we're seeing so much energy devoted to it, because it's a problem right now in front of our face, this energy crisis. Whereas the climate crisis is always something kind of far off or somewhere else, or, impossible to tackle, all at once at one time. But for the first time ever, security policy and climate policy are one. That's really quite remarkable how this happened. Basically, the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, and it changed everything. And so, if there's any grounds to kind of look on the events today, which can all look pretty grim, but with with some hope or enthusiasm, it's that I think we're going to come out stronger. And by that, I also mean the Ukraine. And I think that that Russia has made a huge mistake, which is going to cost them for decades to come. And their reliance on fossil fuels for their economy, both as in terms of export and using at home, is simply going to become less and less valuable to them. And I think they've done them. I think Putin has done Russia a terrible disservice. But that's the way it is.
Well, Paul, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that the entire international community is also praying for the same thing, that not only Ukraine is going to win the war, but also throughout the war and at the end of the conflict, that Ukraine is going to become much stronger than ever. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Mr. Paul Hockenos. And Paul, it's a Berlin writer who covers renewable energy and the climate crisis. He's the prize-winning author of 4 books on European affairs and was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Paul, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to discuss not only about renewable energy and climate crisis, but also around the matters within the international community. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. Enjoyed the discussion.